Suez, a very British crisis.
"50 years ago, a British Prime Minister launched a controversial war in the Middle East that was to divide public opinion. For Anthony Eden, at stake was oil, British influence in the Arab world, and the battle to maintain domination over the jugular vein of empire, the Suez Canal.
Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less for the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser. He's not a man who can be trusted to keep an agreement.
Nasser was a beacon for the Arab world. He was a natural leader and he had charisma. He was a god.
For Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, it was a fight for independence.
Well, the meaning of Suez is that there is an end to the methods of the 19th century.
The breakdown of trust between these two leaders was to mark the start of the crisis.
It's a Shakespearean tale of a politician with lots and lots of good qualities, one fatal flaw. He wanted to show that he was a real tough, strong leader. And look what happened.
There's been an act of aggression against us. We need to respond forcefully and immediately.
As Foreign Secretary in the early 1950s, it fell to Anthony Eden to deal with the emerging crisis in Egypt. Eden was the archetypal boy's own hero. He'd won the Military Cross in the First World War and had intelligence and dashing good looks.
He was the very image of the cultivated, aristocratic diplomat. He was also extremely handsome. So he had a certain Hollywood quality, a sort of star quality.
Eden had an impeccable record in international diplomacy. He served in Churchill's cabinet throughout the Second World War and had famously resigned over Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler.
He disseminated an air of sort of Edwardian courtesy and ease, which was actually rather deceptive. He had got a very good degree in Oriental Studies at Oxford. He was one of that generation who liked to pretend to be perhaps working less hard than they really were.
Eden was so extraordinarily attractive to women. I was struck dumb by the glamour and good looks and elegance of Anthony Eden. I think women fell head over heels in love with Anthony Eden, inevitably.
He would today have been called a smoothie.
In the early 1950s, Cold War tensions were breeding competition and paranoia between East and West. Key to the struggle was the Middle East. Britain was still the dominant power there, and its most important asset was the Suez Canal. The canal was Britain's lifeline for a continual supply of oil and international trade. Over 100 miles cut through the Egyptian desert, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean.
It felt like the kind of mother nucleus of British interests and bases in the Middle East. I mean, I first saw it going through it in a troop ship in 1944 or something on the way to India, and I thought it was tremendously glamorous. 3-funneled liner, apparently going through the desert.
Owned by Britain and France, the canal was policed by 80,000 British troops, the largest military base in the world. It was emblematic of the empire that was rapidly waning.
Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun.
But in Egypt, after 70 years of military occupation, the British were no longer welcome.
During this time, nobody, no Egyptian, can go to the canal zone without a permission from the British authorities. It was very painful for us. These events pushed us to join the resistance at the Canal Zone.
At that time, we didn't know we were arrogant young 18-year-olds. We believed we were in the right and they were the wrong, and they were the wog, as we called them. They were wogs, and they were nothing.
المستعمر تحت أي صورة من الصور بحكم وجوده في أي بلد مستعمرة مبقاش مرغوب فيه.
Occupation leads to conflict.
على أساس إنه ده محتل والمحتل حتى لو ما كانش الحكومة بتاعته بتصرف.
Even if the occupying power shows restraints, the occupying soldiers are human, and sometimes their behavior is not exemplary.
غير كريمة.
I actually saw British troops in Ismailia kicking a little young shoeshine boy across the road, you know, like football. They hated us. They would shout out to us, "Come over here and we'll cut your throat."
There was a major in the intelligence corps. He was abducted, and suddenly his body was, one night, was just dumped in the Sweetwater Canal, and they'd cut off all his badges of rank. He'd been badly mutilated, which was unsettling.
We are not terrorists, but they came to our country and beat us up. We are hot-blooded people, and we could never accept that. So we attacked them.
It escalated so quickly that it caught everybody by surprise. We went in 2 months, 3 months from a peaceful situation to almost a wartime footing.
A young colonel in the Egyptian army, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was ready to take advantage of this groundswell of unrest. He had plans for a new and independent Egypt, and ultimately a dream of Arab nationalism.
He was a politician, a real politician, and a politician with a view, a political, economic, social view, global view.
Because he came from a lower middle class Egyptian family, traditional family from one of the towns in the Delta. And really, the military was his path to something beyond that. But he also obviously acquired a very good command of English along the way. He was self-educated, and he was obviously a deep thinker. Pondered the problems of Egypt and was anxious to do something about it.
Nasser set up a clandestine group called the Free Officers, whose primary aim was to overthrow the corrupt Egyptian government and then force out the British. Egypt was in turmoil. Many Egyptians, even members of the police, were now joining the growing resistance movement against the British. This was a serious challenge to British control.
Near Abbaswar, men of the 16th Independent Parachute Brigade, in a lightning raid, sealed off 2 villages from which Egyptian guerrillas had bombed and sniped our men.
We used to inform the resistance fighters about the location of the British forces in order to attack them. We became a thorn in the side of the British, and they wanted to get rid of this pain.
By January 1952, the attacks on British troops in the Suez Canal zone had escalated. 30 had been killed and 69 wounded. In the face of such resistance, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden called for decisive action.
Dear Prime Minister, the situation in the Canal Zone has deteriorated seriously in the last few days. General Erskine has decided that he must now exercise the authority already given him and disarm the auxiliary police in Ismailia. There'll be repercussions, of course, but what choice do we have? Can't go on. I have discussed the situation this evening with the Chiefs of Staff, and I have suggested, no better make that we have agreed, to proceed with Operation Eagle first thing tomorrow morning. That's all. Mark it immediate.
Operation Eagle was to be a crackdown on the rebellious Egyptian police. Taking advantage of the Muslim holy day, Brigadier Exum of the 3rd Infantry Brigade ordered his troops to surround the Ismailia police buildings. At 6:20 a.m., a British loud hailer van called on the Egyptian police to surrender.
Centurion tanks, armoured cars of the Royal Dragoons and men of the Lancashire Fusiliers prepare to attack Egyptian police headquarters.
The staff involved felt that the show of force by having tanks and armoured cars would be enough to encourage the police to surrender. Unfortunately, what it did, it just stimulated them to react.
My Enfield rifle had only 10 bullets. How could I resist the British forces equipped with tanks, field guns and machine guns?
A young Egyptian police officer, Mustafa Rifat, decided to confront the British. Brigadier Exum gave the police 5 minutes to surrender the building.
I told him, if you are going to stay 50 years, not 5 minutes, this is our land. You shall not leave it. You are going to leave it, not us. I said, we insist not to surrender. So when I go inside, I told them, everyone go to the positions. We are going to fight.
سمعت ضرب طلقات فأخذت الكاميرا.
I heard shots, so I grabbed the camera. I photographed Mustafa Rifat with his men stacking up the sandbags, making fortifications around the building. And with that, the British knew they were not going to surrender.
Obviously, we felt the terror of the situation, but we decided to die as martyrs for the sake of our homeland.
The tank went in, smashed down the gate.
The Egyptian police were firing out of the window, so as their arms came out, I took a shot.
You are working on bodies, screaming here and screaming there.
At 11 a.m., Mustafa Rifat received a phone call from his government's interior minister. The British had forgotten to cut the phone lines.
He said, what's going on? I said, the British attack us. Look and here, boom, boom. We have 11 soldiers killed. And he said, what are you going to do? I said, we are going to stay till we die. He said, God bless you and be God with you. And the telephone was cut.
Headed by tanks, the Lancashires stormed through a breached wall.
There's almost room-to-room fighting, which was not very pleasant. They were bombing hand grenades down the corridors. And as you can imagine, if you have grenades being thrown in close quarters in rooms which were packed with soldiers, there were going to be a lot of serious wounds too. Blood everywhere. It was gruesome.
On the roof, Peter Newton found a dozen bodies and a terribly injured police captain.
He was swearing at the British. Bloody British. Why don't you get out of this effing country? You shouldn't be here anyway. It troubled me because to me, the British Empire had been a wholesome thing. We'd given the world so much. To find that he had so much hate there, I just couldn't really comprehend. So I was very sad for the captain. I just hope he did live out a decent life afterwards.
Untrained, undisciplined and easily agitated, these auxiliaries were a constant menace to our men and the people of Ismailia.
Operation Eagle resulted in the deaths of 50 Egyptian policemen, with many more injured and over 800 taken into British custody.
I went inside and saw them removing the bodies, some of them completely disfigured, I had to photograph the bodies' faces one by one so that we may recognize them. That day they established a specially created martyrs' graveyard.
I returned with Colonel Merritt. When he just go inside, he put his 2 hands on his head and said, "Oh, what a dirty job we have done." He was very, very sad.
There's something like 90 policemen at that station, armed with no more than old, rickety Lee Enfield rifles. The result was in no doubt. It made the Egyptians throughout the country furious.
Outraged by the British attack, Egyptians took to the streets the next day in protest. Cairo was set ablaze. The ferocious anti-British riots came to be known as Black Saturday.
Clusters of people everywhere on the streets, fuming. They were almost, like maniacs. Terrible, in terrible rage. Mad at what happened in Ismailia, and they were trying to take their revenge on Western installations. The fury erupted almost spontaneously. And it started a fire here, a fire there, and then it spread out. There was also a great confectionery shop here called Groppi's. It was Swiss, but they just considered it foreign. The street was strewn with a mix of sweets, cakes, syrup, crazy.
I was playing football for my old school, and we came back to the middle of town. It was all burning. Everything was burning. The Opera House was burning, and the Shepherd's Hotel, which was a very famous hotel, was burning.
For the expatriate British community in Cairo, the destruction of places such as the Shepherd's Hotel represented the end of a way of life.
My father had been in Egypt during the war, and he'd been rather taken by it. And I think at that time it was a magnificent hedonistic capital. So the life there was sweet. And he decided to open a bookshop there. It is probably my earliest memory. I was about 4½. And my father came in, and he stopped in the middle of the carpet, very near me, and he said to my mother, "There's a lot of trouble in the city." And she looked up, and she was still continuing to sew. And then he walked over to the window, and he fell down. And so my mother sprang up from the sofa, and the entire content of the sewing box fell across the floor. So there was this extraordinary sort of spray of buttons and beads. It all came past me as I was sitting on the floor playing. And my father began sobbing. It was extremely shocking to me. And there was this plume of smoke coming up from the point where he knew the shop stood. And he got to his feet and he said, "My God, they've burned it."
But most shocking was the brutal murder of British and Western nationals. At the exclusive Turf Club, members were attacked and beaten to death.
They dragged the British out of it, whoever was there. And there I saw something like 11 or 12 dead bodies on the street, British. And raging demonstrators were kicking them around all the time. Terrible, terrible.
More than 700 buildings were destroyed. 9 Britons and 26 Westerners were killed. The political impact was to prove seismic.
I remember distinctly that there was a meeting with Eden, and which he said, well, we've got to bring the army in immediately.
I want 40,000 troops moved across the desert tonight.
It's not possible, sir.
What do you mean?
They hadn't made the necessary logistical arrangements. You can't just move an army at the twinkling of an eye. And he was absolutely furious, very, very violently furious.
It would really take 3 days to achieve
3 days? For a journey that would take me 3 hours in an ordinary vehicle? Well, what the hell is your army doing while our civilians are being murdered?
Nasser and the free officers now saw their chance. The rioting of Black Saturday was the starting gun of the revolution, the cue for toppling the corrupt King Farouk and the eventual removal of the British. During the riots, King Farouk had remained in the Abdin Palace, but he looked on and did nothing.
People had been hating Farouk for a long time because of the way he ruled the country, the way he had the corrupt people around him, the way his depravity when it came to women and other things.
He used to come and play cards at our apartment, at our flat in Cairo. My mom told me he used to cheat at cards. My mother had a full house in poker. And he just put his cards down and he said, I have 4 kings. And you didn't dare tell the king, show us the cards, of course. And so, in fact, he had 3 kings. And when they asked him, why did you say you had 4 kings? He said, I'm the 4th.
Just before midnight, Nasser and his fellow army officers made their move. They arrested their own commanders and laid siege to the king's palace.
It was scary. It was just scary, but we were young and carefree. It was a peaceful revolution. They just took the king out, and they actually sent him away on his yacht with his money and gave him a 21-gun salute as his yacht left the port of Alexandria.
Some were hugging the soldiers. Others were climbing onto the armored vehicles, and they were chanting, ecstatic.
The revolution was inevitable, and its success was due to its principles and the excellent leadership of Abdel Nasser.
The Revolutionary Command Council was now established under Mohammed Naguib. The real power behind the coup was Gamal Abdel Nasser. With Egyptian hostility mounting and financial pressures at home, Eden realized it was no longer practical to maintain the huge military presence in Suez.
We could undoubtedly deal effectively with any immediate attempt by Egypt to eject us by force from the canal zone. But the situation which this would create would almost certainly compel us to reoccupy Egypt, with all the consequences which this would entail. We should have all world opinion against us, and we'd find it difficult to make our case if Egypt took us to the United Nations. It is hard to see what future there is for such a policy. We cannot afford to keep 80,000 men indefinitely in the canal zone.
The cost was huge, gigantic, keeping 80,000 troops there. We had all these permanent sterling crises, and the Treasury must have been desperate to cut down.
So Eden, ever the diplomat, took the momentous decision to negotiate with Nasser's revolutionary regime for the withdrawal of British troops from the canal. But this decision was met with fury and resistance by a group of conservative politicians known as the Suez Group.
That Suez is basic and vital to the economic survival of our nation and the nations of the Commonwealth.
Giving up the canal base was seen as surrendering British imperial power.
There was this group of MPs around Julian Emery and Charles Waterhouse and so on, who objected that we were sacrificing something of great importance and that we were in danger of undermining our position in the Middle East. I've no doubt they were wrong, but they did have a certain amount of support in the Conservative Party. And this meant that when Eden concluded the agreement with Nasser, he paid a certain political price.
Eden clashed furiously with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who who was unwilling to see Britain lose its control in Suez. This disagreement with Churchill was made worse by the fact that Eden was the known Prime Minister in waiting, but that Churchill was still clinging on to office in his 79th year.
The one occasion I do remember, which was at Chartwell. Eden had come to stay for the weekend, and he was sitting with Churchill in the study. And I remember Churchill looking at him and saying, "Why do you look at me with hungry eyes? You're not yet 60. And the look of total despair just crossed Eden's face. He never answered. And then he went out of the room. There was no way he could get past the implacable determination of Churchill to stay in office.
In the summer of 1952, Eden enhanced his glamorous reputation by marrying Clarissa, Churchill's niece.
And here's the bride. She's wearing an orchid pink dress. It's silk shantung with a large spray of orchids instead of a bouquet. At Caxton Hall, where they'll be married, Mr. Eden faces the barrage of cameras. And if you want proof of the gaiety and joy of this occasion for us all, just listen to the crowd.
As Nasser's reputation as the figurehead of Arab nationalism was growing, the world began to take note. Now, both East and West were wooing him. One American diplomat began to forge links with the glamorous new strongman in the Middle East.
Nasser really liked Esther Williams' films. So we had some in the embassy in the Cultural Affairs Department. So I arranged to borrow a projector and a screen, and several times when he came, we would put it up at the end of the living room, and we'd sit there and watch Esther Williams be sporting herself in the pools and so on. She was quite a sleek lady in her swimsuit. It was a perfectly, innocent sort of thing, but it was outside. Nasser and his friends would like to have hot dogs when they came to the house. So the first meal that he had with us was hot dogs, when we were able to get all beef hot dogs from the embassy commissaries. Nasser and I would get out on the balcony together to talk about what he was concerned about. It wasn't like that he wanted to replace British ties with American ties. It was a feeling that we could be a sort of honest broker between the two. I guess we sort of operate on the theory that it really was time for the British to move along and give up this idea of military presence in Egypt.
In a bid to hasten the British withdrawal, Egyptian insurgents stepped up the pressure, not only targeting the troops, but also their families. They were no longer safe, even in their homes.
Imagine you get up and you're in an atmosphere where people detest you and want to destroy you. And you find a dagger and a pamphlet in your bedroom threatening to harm your child. Through these pamphlets, we were able to put pressure on the troops.
Even the negotiations themselves were being manipulated.
We used to gather information about the British military bases. When the British tried to be a little tougher in the negotiations, we would intensify the operations against them. And when they were softer, we would lighten the operations.
In London, concern grew for the safety of the 27,000 British civilians resident in Egypt. Eden stepped up the negotiations to get the troops out of Egypt. In return, he sought safeguards for British interests in the canal. But it was a gamble that depended on being able to trust Nasser. For Eden, it was an act of faith. He revealed his anxiety and need for support from the US in a letter to President Eisenhower.
We are being asked to give up something of real value. It is something which we have created as a result of the experience which we gained in the last war, at the cost of so many lives and so much expenditure of time and money. We are being asked to substitute for this, which we now hold, an agreement, which must in part be an act of faith in Egypt. And on this agreement will rest an essential element of the defense of the free world against aggression. That is why your help is so necessary.
But just as discussions were beginning in Egypt, Eden was struck down by a severe illness.
He'd had this disastrous surgical intervention for a gallbladder operation. When the surgeon had cut through the bile duct, the result was that he had these periodic bouts of high fever, very high fever, which laid him out.
After the first operation, the surgeon in Boston who'd done it said, well, you may be able to lead quite a normal life. You probably can do little things like sailing. Well, I mean, 3 months later, he was back at the Foreign Office, working day and night.
It's grand to be home again after so long an absence. And the doctor, the surgeon who operated on me, told me yesterday that all was well. There was nothing else to worry about.
But beneath the apparent recovery lay a condition which would dog Eden for the rest of his career. Finally, Eden and NASA reached agreement over the canal zone.
At long last, agreement has been reached. The main clause of the agreement states that all our troops will have left Egypt within 20 months and may only return if Egypt, any other Arab state, or Turkey is attacked. These terms have created some indignation in Britain. Nevertheless, after a tense debate, the government secured approval for their actions. The pact has put Colonel Nasser in an even more powerful position.
It was a great feeling of happiness. After 72 years of occupation, we realized a very big victory, expelling the British occupiers out of Egypt, with Nasser as the driving force. And after signing the agreement, instructions were issued to halt all kinds of aggression against the British army.
With the withdrawal of the troops, the British adopted another strategy to maintain security in the Middle East. Along with the Americans, they helped found the Baghdad Pact, a pro-Western, anti-communist alliance of Middle Eastern states. But Nasser had no intention of entering such an alliance. He was more interested in consolidating his own power and influence in the region. Nasser set up the radio station Saut al-Arab, Voice of the Arabs, to carry his defiant position of Arab nationalism.
The microphone served the revolution well. The revolutionaries utilized the radio station as an effective tool to send their message about ending colonialism.
Saut al-Arab was highly popular throughout the Middle East. It called for Arab unity and freedom from imperialism. But the vitriolic broadcasts put Eden under huge pressure.
Newspapers used to make a great deal of fuss about Radio Cairo, which was vitriolic and fairly rough. We were continually bombarded by Number 10 to say, had we seen this and what did we make of that, and wasn't this really provocative and so on? And the answer was yes, it was, and it was meant to be. It was a very hostile program.
Eden decided it was time to meet Nasser face to face. It was the first and only time the two men would ever meet.
We were on our way to Bangkok for the CETO conference. We stopped off for one night in Cairo. And so the ambassador gave a dinner for Anthony to meet Nasser. And Nasser came to dinner, and he appeared to be sort of boisterous and happy and shouted away.
Each man came to the dinner confident of reaching an agreement. Eden wanted Nasser's propaganda station to cease from its anti-British broadcasts and still had hopes of drawing Egypt into the Baghdad Pact.
Mr. Eden was faced by an absolute refusal in that regard. The argument of the Egyptian president was that you want us to join a pact against the Soviet Union, which is thousands of miles away and doesn't pose a threat, whereas the country that is a threat to Egypt is actually Israel, which is very close.
Nasser, opposed to foreign interference in the Middle East, sought assurances from Eden that he would stop encouraging other Arab states to join the alliance. He was more concerned with the ongoing struggle with neighboring Israel. On the surface, the dinner had gone well, but proved to be an utter disaster.
He came up to my room afterwards and said, well, that went all right. But it turned out that Nasser had been deeply offended by every moment of the evening. He hadn't had the right clothes because the ambassador and Anthony had thought that Nasser coming to dinner, they better have black ties. And Nasser wasn't dressed right, and he was offended by the grandeur of the embassy. And then he was deeply offended because Anthony talked to him a bit in Arabic. He just felt inferior in every way, and then he was being upstaged, I think.
Ultimately, both men were disappointed. Eden pursued his attempts to get more Arab states to join the pact, infuriating Nasser.
When we tried to get Jordan into it as well, that was taken by Nasser as a provocation, because we had made Nasser a promise that we would not try and recruit Jordan. So Nasser thought he was being double-crossed.
Eden thought that he had secured a deal with Nasser, that Nasser would drop the incessant propaganda from Radio Cairo directed against our interests in the Middle East. The attacks on the Canal Zone base, for example, would be scaled down or stopped. But when he returned to London and found that everything went on as before, exactly, he felt that Nasser had betrayed him in a way, that he'd been deceived. It caused him certainly to regard Nasser as unfriendly, if not an enemy.
We are entitled to ask Egypt where she stands. If Nasser wishes to continue to denounce Britain and to oppose British policy in every way, let him say so. If not, let him make determined efforts to carry out the promise he made to me, and he will find me more than willing to meet him halfway.
Just 1 week after Eden's visit to Cairo, Israel made a raid on Egyptian territory in Gaza, killing 36 Egyptians and Palestinians on what had been a troubled frontier. Nasser came under severe pressure to equip the Egyptian army and the Palestinian fighters against the Israelis. He looked to Britain to buy arms.
Finally, he said to his quartermaster general, look, get over there and just find out what they're prepared to sell us. I don't buy anything. Pea shooter, catapult. See where they are. And there was an argument about everything. There was even an argument about some biplane, and the quartermaster clearly went back saying, you're not going to get anything out of them. Don't bother trying.
As Britain, along with the Americans, would not sell Nasser arms, he was determined to look elsewhere. To the horror of the West, Nasser made a deal with the Soviet bloc.
It was a big shock, because it suggested that the threat of communism spreading through the Middle East was real, and that NASA had, in a sense, sold out.
Eden finally realized his dream of becoming Prime Minister. And while Eden began promoting his vision of peace and prosperity to an adoring nation, NASA was devising his own strategy to bring Egypt into the modern world. He wanted to build a dam across the River Nile. The building of the Aswan Dam was seen as a cure for all Egypt's ills, and NASA staked his own position and prestige on the success of the project. The main obstacle for NASA was finance. The World Bank agreed to lend Egypt $200 million, with the United States and Britain pledging additional millions. But in London, Eden feared that NASA's plan to build up Egypt would extend his influence to neighboring Arab states and eclipse British control in the Middle East.
I think we were concerned with NASA's influence outside Egypt as much as we were concerned with his influence inside Egypt.
For Eden, NASA's most irritating means of influence was still Egyptian radio.
The voice of Egypt continues unchecked and pours out its propaganda into the area of our oil fields. We have simply got to take action as quickly as possible.
This suspicion of NASA was further inflamed by Selwyn Lloyd, Eden's foreign secretary. On meeting NASA in Cairo, he wrote,
NASA was fatter and more self-confident than when I saw him last. He smiled a great deal more, for no apparent reason. He did not exactly condescend, but he gave the impression that he could do more harm to us than we could do to him.
Eden was already getting disenchanted with NASA, and I think Selwyn's communications were simply reinforcing this conviction that NASA was an unmitigated menace to British interests, capable of essentially subverting what we regarded as friendly regimes, from Baghdad to Saudi Arabia to Jordan.
He saw him certainly as an Arab nationalist, which he was, and that in a sense, of course, was a threat to the more traditional regimes. But he also saw him as a potential agent of the Soviet Union.
At the same time, MI6 intelligence reports suggested NASA was in the pocket of the Soviets, plotting to overthrow every Arab monarchy. These reports were later proved suspect, but they fueled Eden's increasingly hostile view of NASA.
The pattern is familiar to many of us, my friend. We all know this is how fascist governments behave. And we all remember, only too well, what the cost can be in giving in to fascism.
He, after all, had really made his name, resigning from the Chamberlain's government in the late 30s, standing up to the dictators, being Churchill's foreign secretary throughout the war, and he just believed that you had to stand up to dictators.
I think his view of NASA was that NASA was dangerous, and that he was a dictator, and that you ought to stand up to him, and surely whatever the cost in money and blood, you had to do this.
Eden, who didn't need much to fuel his suspicion of NASA, decided the game was up. It was time to try and get rid of him.
Secretly, Britain considered different options against NASA.
Well, MI6 undertook very many activities. It had embedded itself into the Suez Canal Company. The goal of this was to attack the regime, or to participate in any attempt to assassinate NASA by one means or another.
I think by subversive NASA, perhaps people like the Prime Minister might mean not flinching from covert activity. In such cases, you say, what would happen if something were found out to be so about NASA? If necessary, some semi-fabricated thing about NASA which would discredit him in Arab eyes. What would happen if an Egyptian assassinated NASA?
Eden made his views clear when he called the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, who was having dinner at the Savoy.
What's all this poppycock you sent me? This nonsense about isolating Nasser or neutralizing him, as you call it. I want him destroyed, can't you understand? I want him removed. And if you and the Foreign Office don't agree, you better come down to Cabinet to explain why.
There was no attempt on his life or anything that I know of. It certainly was never put into practice. The mood wasn't focused on that, if you see what I mean. But it was obviously an option.
Nasser's power was in the ascendant. 10 days after the last British troops left Egypt, Nasser became president. It was the end of 74 years of occupation. But the Egyptian celebrations were short-lived.
A man who was the president of the World Bank, Eugene Black, came to dinner and told us, "We just committed the biggest blunder in the history of the world today." And I said, "What?" He said, "On the orders of Mr. Foster Dulles," who was the Secretary of State for Eisenhower, he said, "We refused to loan Nasser money to build the Aswan Dam."
Nasser was not even told this devastating news personally. He heard it secondhand.
We were on the plane with President Nasser and President Nehru. They were sitting next to each other when President Nasser looked over at me and said, "See what the international news is." The first item on the BBC was a statement by an official American spokesperson saying that the United States had taken the decision to cut off the financing of the High Dam. Plainly speaking, Egypt was bankrupt.
As Nasser was regarded, both by us and by the Americans, as having sold out to the Soviet Union, neither of us were prepared to go ahead and finance the dam. But it had to be done with a certain care because obviously it was going to provoke some sort of reaction and might drive Nasser further into the arms of the Soviet Union. So we were therefore in favor of playing it long. The Americans, on the other hand, without consulting with us, quite suddenly withdrew their support, which made it, of course, inevitable that we would have to do the same.
Churchill described Dulles once as the only man he knew who took his own bull around with him when he visited a china shop. And that was Dulles' approach. And Dulles thought, well, this man Nasser's getting above himself, I'm going to teach him a lesson. And suddenly, without even telling Eden in advance, he announced that the Americans were withdrawing support for the building of the dam.
Mr. Dulles, in withdrawing the offer, issued a statement saying he had no confidence in the Egyptian economy and implicitly in the Egyptian regime, in Nasser. And Nasser considered it a great insult.
I was surprised by the insultive attitude which the refusal was declared. Not by the refusal itself, but the insultive attitude and which meant humiliation, because they said that the refusal was because of our financial situation and the economy and so on.
Dulles' calculation was that that would bring down Nasser. And of course, it was greeted with total dismay in Egypt when the news came out. But Nasser, being the sort of man he was, hit back.
Nasser, humiliated and furious, decided to rid Egypt of foreign influence once and for all. He called his closest allies together in a secret meeting to plot an audacious new way to finance the dam.
Nasser said, "I'm going to nationalize the Suez Canal Company." He said the revenue would finance the building of the dam. I said it was a masterstroke, but would be controversial. But he said he had made up his mind.
In an operation codenamed Dignity and Glory, Egyptian troops would seize the offices of the Suez Canal Company. Nasser would trigger the action during a speech to the nation.
He said, "In my speech I will raise objections to the Suez Canal and how it was built. The code word between us is de Lesseps. When I say de Lesseps, you start implementing nationalization. Is that clear? Clear, sir. Go. What's required now is secrecy, secrecy, secrecy."
The significance of the choice of code word was not lost on his collaborators. De Lesseps was the French engineer who had first built the canal in 1869.
If we fail in nationalizing the Suez Canal, then Egypt would lose the Suez Canal forever. So we were honored from one side, but on the other hand, we were worried.
Nasser had other considerations, some of them selfish. One of them, the selfish one, was he wanted to promote himself to enhance his standing in the Arab world as a nationalist leader.
At Manshir Square in Alexandria, Nasser began his speech. It was to last for 3 hours. It was an anxious wait for the men listening on the radio for the code word to set off for the Suez Canal Company headquarters.
Waiting for President Nasser saying the secret word de Lesseps was a hell of a period. His speech before saying this word seems like a century. But once he said it, the three groups started moving to their directives in either Ismailia, Port Said, or Suez.
I was trembling not from fear but with joy. I felt that we were entering into the realization of a very big goal that was a dream. And that dream was being achieved, regardless of the consequences that may follow.
They stormed into the Suez Canal Company, explaining to the staff there that they were taking over.
We said it is not confiscation, it is nationalization. It was a moment I will never forget.
We listened to the speech, and he made a wonderful speech. He said, I tried everything. I went to he spoke in a colloquial Arabic. He said, I went to the Americans and I asked them for a loan. I went to the World Bank, I asked them for a loan to build the dam because our population is growing so quickly. We will need electricity, we will need sources of energy. And they refused. And so I found myself without any means. The only thing I could do was nationalize what we have, what is in our country right here.
Nasser finished his speech by announcing that the canal was being reclaimed in the name of the people. The vast crowd went wild, shouting. National radio carried this speech across the Arab world.
My colleagues and I couldn't control ourselves and threw the microphones down. We hugged each other, as did the thousands who were in the crowd in Alexandria.
I felt that something that belonged to Egypt had been restored. My real feeling at the time was one of national pride.
I want you to call in all the chiefs of staff. Tell them that to come at once. And we'll need the French ambassador and the American chargé d'affaires just as soon as they can make it.
The shock was tremendous. The sense of great crisis was immediate.
Eden was hosting an official dinner at Downing Street in honor of King Faisal of Iraq when he heard the news.
I want you to know, and I think the opposition should know too, what Nasser has done tonight. He has made a speech announcing that he's going ahead with the Aswan Dam, and in order to finance it, Egypt is taking over the Suez Canal Company.
What are you going to do?
I have asked the American chargé d'affaires to come at once, and the French ambassador. This is an international crisis. I think we should take it to the Security Council.
Yes, and supposing Nasser doesn't take any notice?
Well, I suppose in that case the old-fashioned ultimatum will be necessary.
Well, look, you should act quickly, whatever you do. And as far as Great Britain is concerned, you'll almost certainly have public opinion behind you. But you will have to get the Americans into line.
The Egyptian people and all the Arab peoples had opened the door to a new destiny for the Arab nation.
My very strong feeling is that we cannot allow Nasser to get away with this. We must not allow him to have his hand on our windpipe. How quickly can we capture the canal?
I'm afraid an adequate force for the invasion of Egypt. We could not put an operation together like this in less than 6 or 7 weeks.
I was instructed between 51 and 53 to prepare a paper on what we should do if the Egyptian government unilaterally nationalized the Suez Canal. And I consulted the legal advisors, and they came down with the view that the Egyptians had every right under international law to nationalize the canal, always provided two things. One, that they gave proper compensation to the shareholders, of whom we were one, and secondly, that they observed a free transit through the canal for ships of all nations. This paper was fed into Eden at his first meeting after nationalization. And he took one look at this paper, glanced through the conclusions, and said, "This is no fucking good," and chucked it across the room. And this suggests that he was disposed to the use of force, really, more or less from the beginning.
Eden, set on reclaiming the canal at any price, was about to embark on a gamble that would take the nation to war and cost him his career.
Colonel Nasser's action has presented us with an opportunity.